Well, we are living and breathing and in an age when, we can be very grateful that we have around us legends who connect with the history of this incredible music, and I'm referring, of course, to Archie Shepp. I just want to acknowledge that Archie will be performing this evening with a great quartet that includes Lafayette Harris, Avery Sharpe, and Ronnie Burrage, and that's at 7 o'clock this evening. And are you on tour right now? Are you?
No. In fact, just returning from Paris with my wife, and we had happened to have a gig here, and fortunately, I'm back in Portland. I haven't been here for 40 years, I believe. I think the last time I was here was sometime in the 80s or the late 70s.
Does it feel the same?
Yeah. I mean, it looks like a small town, but it's really quite large.
It is.
Yeah. And the people, at least in Portland, have been very nice, and I'm very happy to be back here.
Before we jump back into anything historical, I wanted to also ask about the music tonight, because here's some coffee for you.
Thank you.
Not only are you going to be playing the tenor sax, which is, of course, the instrument that you're most associated with, but you sing now as well, and you have this beautiful baritone voice. And
thank you.
Can you tell us about what we can expect musically this evening?
Well, I never know what you can expect musically. Well, that's the nature of, I suppose, jazz, if you like it. There's always the element of surprise. Hopefully a good surprise. I'll try to do a little of this and a little of that, some originals, and I'm a big fan of Duke Ellington, and my tradition really is. So I try to include or to create a diverse program, sometimes using poems. I like to add the element of theater to music performance. I acquired that habit over the years since I was in college. When I started university and college at Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont. Goddard is a little like Reed. It has a kind of a background of experimentalism. Teachers who actually changed the name of education. So, to put it short, when I started college, I'd only thought of recordings as musical events, and then I met a man, Joe Rosenberg, who taught theater, and I started to get into more literature. One evening I was in what we call the Manor Lounge, and we went there to recreate and play music and so on. And someone put on a recording of Ezra Pound, and then T.S. Eliot, E.E. Cummings, Archibald MacLeish, and I began to realize that recordings were not only for music, because prior to that, I'd listened to recordings about Duke, and my father had a really nice collection. So I only thought of recordings as being for music, and for the first time I realized that literary events, theater, could be performed on recordings. So by the time I graduated and I made my first recording, I thought of combining music with poetry and so on. So I expect to do a little bit of that as well.
That's fantastic. You know, the idea that there's this consistency between the way that you looked at music in the 50s when you were at Goddard in Vermont, and now, you know, is that your view as it was forged in those years.
Well, yeah, and then I had a play I wrote that was done off Broadway in the 60s, and a couple of other one-act plays I did. One that was presented at Brooklyn College with Maurice Watkins directing. Maurice was the guy who taught Larry, what's his name? He's a movie actor. It was in Spike Lee's play.
Lawrence Fishburne?
Fishburne.
Yeah.
He was Larry's coach in college, and he presented my play at Brooklyn College. I had another one-act play done at Howard University during those times. So literature has also been very important for me, and particularly playwriting. I wrote plays after I got out of college, but I realized that somehow music was calling me, and I had the chance to record with Cecil Taylor in
1960.
Yeah, and so I haven't stopped since. But actually, I've been playing music for about 60 years. So, I mean, I used to be able to get up the stairs without having to be helped, but it's come to that.
But you have this incredible legacy of nearly 100 recordings, 100 albums.
Yeah, quite a few recordings.
And he turns 83 in a few days.
No, not in a few days. Let's hope in a few months.
Oh, in a few months.
Yeah,
okay.
in May.
I got that wrong from Monette. Yeah. I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's May 24th.
Is that the same night, and you have a gig that night in Atlanta?
In Atlanta, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Lucky Atlantans. I hope you celebrate 83.
I hope so, yeah. Lucky me. That's it. Yeah.
So again, we're going to ask you guys if you have any questions that you would like to ask of Mr. Shepp. We have the microphone here. Please, feel free. If I see you, I'll call on you.
Plus de sucre, s'il te plaît. No, sorry.
A little more sucre.
Yeah.
Okay.
A little more sugar.
Well,
yes, ma'am.
Take the microphone if you would. Thank you.
You amazed me when you mentioned Reed College. I mean, it's very well known here and to a certain group of people, but why are you familiar with it?
Well, Reed was among the schools that introduced innovative techniques in education, probably influenced by William Hurd Kilpatrick, John Dewey. They were important educators during the 30s, and there were a few schools that were rather prominent in our conversation around at Goddard during that time. Black Mountain, and I think in North Carolina, Bard College, Reed was among them, for being academic institutions that were innovating, that played an innovative role at the time. who acknowledged the importance of society and education being connected. That as students, we should not only think of getting an education, but combining an education with playing a more socially dynamic role, as well as being an outstanding, having an outstanding academic reputation for teachers that were not only innovative but creative. So anyway, I knew about Reed, Black Mountain, Bard, to some degree Bennington College. They were the schools that were innovative, especially during the 30s, because, the 30s which followed the 20s, you might say, so the era of the Depression economically, and some schools, many didn't see the role of education as being engaged with changing society, making it, but it was important. And anyway, I knew about Reed College.
There you go. So I promised you, that I would bring up some of the discoveries that have happened when I've been talking with Mr. Shepp. And one of them is that Archie's experience when he first was breaking into music in his hometown of Philly, and Philadelphia being this incredibly fertile music scene, included some very familiar names in jazz, history that include like Lee Morgan, etc., that you grew up with.
Yeah, Bobby Timmons, Bill Barron.
Bobby Timmons.
That was before his brother became famous, Kenny.
Before Kenny Barron, there's Bill Barron.
Yeah.
Right.
And the guy I studied with, I'm trying to think of his name, Tony Mitchell. They were all associated with John Coltrane, and they were all contemporaries. And
so they were on the scene, and you were coming up.
They were on the scene, yeah.
Right.
I learned a lot from that ambience. There were so many fine musicians around me at the time. And this was true all over the United States. I mean, out in California, there were people like Eric Dolphy and Yusef Lateef in Detroit. It was not only the people who were around me in Philadelphia, but people, the black music tradition extended throughout the United States, Washington, Cleveland, Philadelphia, San Francisco. I suppose you had guys that were right around here in Portland who may or may not be so well known. Like Buck Washington was a really fine saxophone player from Washington, but really never gained much of a reputation except among other musicians. So the thing is that the black tradition in music is you might say universal in a way. Guys like Lester Young, who come from Mississippi, but was born in Mississippi, but played as far away as Oklahoma and Minnesota. So it's a tradition that was a continuum. John Lewis was raised in New Mexico, I believe.
Right.
Yeah, and when you think about it, that the Negro spiritual, that black music was being played everywhere. In Baltimore, they sang spirituals, and just like they did down in Mississippi and Florida.
It's more specifically to your time period, is the idea that, we're talking about the period right after bebop settles in, but there's also this kind of jump blues and R&B happening at the same time, and you have this divide starting to happen between kind of dance music that's well-paying gigs and the more artistic, more focused on jazz that's happening too. And you had many of your contemporaries in Philadelphia were kind of balancing on both sides of the line, like Lee Morgan, etc. And I remember you telling me about how they looked upon you at the very beginning.
Yeah, I met Lee, and they used to have jam sessions for young kids in Philadelphia, because at the time you had to be 21 to get into a bar. So young people didn't have the privileges that older people did. And there was a guy named Tom Roberts, who was a radio announcer, who set up this activity for young people. And he would invite the big names who were playing in town. On Friday afternoons, the kids could go down and hear the big professionals, Glenn Webster, Max, Art Blakey, guys like that. And after that, they would have the young kids perform. And Lee Morgan was frequently there, and he performed before the professionals or after they had played. And I was very impressed by his technique, his swing, and so on.
Were you anywhere near that level at that point, or were you totally intimidated?
Yeah, totally. Even now, sometimes, I listen to some of the guys that I really admired. And Lee was a little younger than I am, but I suppose he was kind of a genius. He used to call all the guys he liked, he'd say, he's a genius, man, he's a genius. But actually, he was a genius. He was only 15 or 16 and playing then with professionals like John Coltrane, Clarence Sharpe, and guys around. So I asked him if he would help me to learn to play chord changes. On a horn, it's quite a bit different from a piano, because on a piano you can see the chords, but on a horn you can't see the chords. You have to put them together melodically, and so he consented to, very graciously, to let me come to his home, and we had a little jam session. Well, at that time, I only heard Stan Getz, because they didn't play many African Americans on the radio, on the main stations. They did. You could hear Fats Waller, or maybe Jimmy Lunsford, the bands, and so on. And, Fats was, of course, quite he was well known, and they did play him from time to time. But Stan Getz was probably the only jazz man that you would hear from time to time. Maybe Lee Kahn did from time to time. But I had heard Stan's version of How High the Moon, and that was what I had sort of learned and trying to get his sounds. And so he asked me to play something for him, and when he did that, I reached for my version of Stan's version of How High the Moon, and I noticed that he had a guy he played with frequently, Kenny Rogers. They were sort of snickering on the side. I don't think they were very impressed by my imitation of Stan Getz. And furthermore, they didn't like Stan Getz that much either, so... So they might have asked me to play another song, and I think it was looking pretty hopeless. And finally, he said, well, let's play the blues. Well, my father, that's how I got into music, played the banjo, and my first instrument had actually been the banjo. And the blues, I not only knew what the chords were, but I could sing the blues. I knew the blues from inside.
This is from being down in Florida?
Born in Florida, yeah. And that's the music, the people there. And so I took the first course, and when we were finished, he seemed to be rather impressed, and he said, man, don't ever change. And that's how I got to meet Lee, and frequently after that, when he had blues gigs, only the blues, he would call me to play because it's something I had a feeling for, and I knew. As I say, I had not only learned the chords to the blues, but I could sing the blues, which means I really felt them from the inside. And, I could sing the St. Louis blues. I hate to see that evening sun go down. It was something that was endemic, intrinsic.
Thank you for sharing that story. Auditioning for a 15-year-old Lee Morgan.
Yeah. He was a young kid, you know, you wouldn't believe it, but he played with all the big names around town. I remember when he was hired by Dizzy Gillespie, we were in a bar they called Pep's Bar at Broad South in Philly, and the only reason we were able to get in was because all the barkeepers, they knew him. Even though he was under 21, he would frequently be able to get into places where none of the other kids could get into because he performed. He was a professional.
Was it Pep's where Freddie Freeloader was the bartender, or was it Showboat?
Well, they were only a block apart.
Okay.
I don't know. It could have been either one. Showboats at Broad and Locust, and Pep's at Broad and South. And Freddie could have been at either one of them, maybe both. Yeah.
This is the gentleman who the famous track from Kind of Blue is named after. He's a bartender in Philly.
Freddie Freeloader. Yeah.
Freddie Freeloader.
Yeah.
Those are incredible
I'll
stories.
bring you a story about him. When I met Freddie, I had seen him, and I said, Freddie Freeloader. And he looked at me and said, no, I said, Freddie the Freeloader. He said, no, the. Freddie Freeloader. Yeah.
Being corrected by Freddie.
Yeah.
Freddie Tibbert, I think, was his real name.
Tolbert.
Tolbert.
Well,
okay.
His name is Tolbert, but he seemed to like the French pronunciation. Freddie Tolbert.
Again, we have the microphone. Feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Shepp, for coming.
Thank you,
I wanted to ask you a question about Attica Blues. It's one of my favorite albums of yours. Did you, because of the writings that you've done in the past, and sometimes you were saying in the beginning here that you do singing and you also read from your plays, did you kind of set up Attica Blues as a play?
Well, you know, that's interesting. I suppose it, even though I might not have done that consciously, I saw all my recordings as somehow having some theatrical connection. So it might have been that. I not only thought of Attica Blues as a piece of music, but at that time there were a lot of terrible things going on in the prisons. There probably still are. But it was around the time of the assassination of George Jackson and the Attica prison uprising. So in a way, I suppose I put all that together as probably being representative of the black community itself and the enormous tragedies that we suffered as far as housing, education, violence. So I probably had about 20 musicians on my recording, and partly it was because that recording represented the community to me, and the musicians had another role to play as far as I was concerned. But they represented not only people who played instruments, but they were actually born out of the situation that we were facing. That criminality, violence was being expressed through their instruments, love. So yeah, it might have had a connection in my thought, if not in my conscious thoughts. That's the way it turned out. Yeah.
Thank you for the question, sir.
I did go to Reed College.
Oh,
but like you,
I'm glad to meet you. I never
like
met,
you,
never met a Reed man, but
I'd
or
rather
a woman.
I'd rather not discuss it further.
But you do have a question.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask if you could comment on the film. I believe it was called Imagine the Sound from a number of years ago. And, excuse me. I heard you perform here almost 40 years ago at Portland Center for the Visual
you were
Arts.
there, yeah.
And I was wondering if you have been in Portland since then.
No, I haven't been. I haven't been back. I had.
So this is a reunion.
Yeah.
You could say that, yeah. Yeah.
Anyhow, I was very intrigued by that film. And if you had any thoughts to share about that.
Well, I think, as I remember, it was made by a guy named Ron Mann, and I wrote a piece for the pianist Elmo Hope, and after that I wrote another piece for Elmo, which I'll probably perform this evening. It's called Hope 2, because it was the second composition that I wrote for Elmo. The film you're referring to contains the first composition I wrote for Elmo Hope. But I don't have many memories of the recording, except to know that, as I remember, we did it in Canada.
Please use the mic.
Cecil Taylor has performed as well.
Okay.
Hey, girl, what you doing here?
The most incredible thing that happened in my life was meeting this man, a really hip dope dealer, like turned me on to Archie Shepp. I walked up there on the stage, at the New Morning, and I was scared shitless. He said, "Oh, baby, what do you want to sing?" And I said, "Well, Misty in the key of B flat." I was so terrified. I am so thankful for all the opportunities you have offered, not just me, but all different types of artists. You just blessed me. I will never, ever forget you. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
That lady is Annette Lohman, who lives here in Oregon. She's quite a fine vocalist, and we met maybe 40 years ago or so. How many? I don't want to.
Okay, not 40, 23.
Excuse me.
But I'm going to have to ask you guys to identify yourselves. You know, if you're going to come up with stories like that, we want to know who you are. So from now on, if you come to the microphone, first tell us who you are, and then proceed.
I'm Don.
Hey, Don.
This is not exactly a jazz question, but it's certainly a musical question. Years ago, I heard your tribute to Martin Luther King. That's the work that Malcolm Goldstein was on the violin.
Yeah. Have you seen Malcolm?
It came out of that era that you're talking about with all of those terrible things. I was so moved by it. I've tried years and years to find a copy of it. My question is, did you ever record that, or did you play it often?
No, we didn't play it often. It was inspired by my relationship with Malcolm Goldstein, and we were quite good friends at the time, and he was socially committed, and as were many of my friends, he was a musical activist, and unfortunately we didn't get to record it, but we did perform the piece from time to time. It was completely improvised, so it was always different each time we did it.
Thanks for the question.
My name's Stephen. You did a wonderful album, which everyone should have at least 4 copies of. Four for Coltrane. And you did a very different version of Naima than the original recording. There were, in fact, counter lines. There were numerous...
Yeah, that was the arrangement by Roswell Rudd.
Wonderful arrangement, Roswell Rudd, yeah. But I just thought, was that something that, have you, as the previous question, did you do it again? Is it something that you incorporate if you ever do, when you repeat that? Do you think of that particular arrangement?
Well, I have recorded and have performed Naima on several occasions, but never exactly like the arrangement on that recording for Coltrane, because it was a written arrangement, and it has several different movements, canon arrangements that would make it difficult for me just to perform it as it is done on that recording, because I no longer have the music. And even then, I try not to use written music during my performances. I try to make it as much like the old New Orleans days as possible. That is completely improvised and non-academic.
And such a great album for Coltrane.
Yeah, I did that for Impulse Records.
That was your very first album for
Impulse? It was my first album for them, yeah. And it was quite interesting because I had been calling them trying to get a recording date for quite a while, and each time I called, the A&R man, the guy who actually managed all the records of John Coltrane to a certain point,
Bob Thiel,
yeah. He had a secretary, Lillian, and she would always say, well, Bob's not here. He's gone for the day, or he's out for lunch. So finally I got the courage to ask John Coltrane, who was a mentor to me and remains a person that I regard very highly. I asked him one night he was performing at the Half Note down on Spring Street on the intermission. I said, well, John, would you talk to Bob Thiel for me? Because every time I call, he's either gone for the day or out for lunch. So he looked at me, gave me another intense look, and he said, you know, a lot of people think I'm easy. And they did. They took advantage of John, of his kindness and his accessibility. And so I reassured him, John, I'm not trying to take advantage of you. It's just that I've got 4 kids and I need some help. And so he said, well, I'll see what I can do. And the next day I called Impulse for Bob. Lillian said to me, well, he's going to lunch. And that was, but then she followed it up with, he'll be back. and he's expecting your call. So that's how I got to do that recording for Portland, and it turned out to be pretty good. When I arrived at the studio to do the recording, it was at Rudy Van Gelder's. Rudy had done a lot of great recordings of Miles and J.J. Johnson for Blue Note Records back in the day. And he was an optometrist, and he did all the recordings at that point in his basement. But by the time I got the chance to record for him, he had built a beautiful studio out in, I think,
Englewood Cliffs.
Englewood Cliffs in New Jersey. It's like a...
I live about 20 minutes away from where it still is, so...
Yeah, and it has the air of a cathedral, which has been done in beautiful teak wood, and nobody can touch Rudy's microphones. He at least at that point, he himself only touched them with gloves. He had plastic gloves, and it was a monument to music. And Bob was standing way down there. It's a large place with high ceilings. And Bob was smoking his pipe. He didn't even turn around to look at me because he didn't like what they called free jazz at all. He only did that because of John Coltrane. And he was puffing his pipe. I could see puffs of pipe smoke blowing. But he didn't turn around to look at me even. And so we did the first recording, first take, and then by the time we did the second, he said, hey, this stuff is great. He said, I'm going to call Coltrane and ask him to come down. And John lived out on Long Island. It's quite a ways. And it was about 11 o'clock in the evening. So he called John and he said, hey, John, this stuff is great, you know, and I want you to come out. And eventually we took some photo ops, pictures, one of which was used on the album. And if you notice, look carefully, you'll see that John doesn't have on any socks. I don't know, but because some people say he didn't wear socks much anyway, because he had the same problems with his feet that I had, and probably a little worse. And, in fact, he commented once when asked about his feet. He said, "Even the air hurts." So he might not have had on any socks because he's had problems with his feet.
4 for Train, everyone. Still a great album. Yeah.
Hello, my name is...
I think we have time for one more question because we're going to have to allow Mr. Shepp to get ready to do sound check and, prepare for the 7 o'clock concert tonight at Newmark. Roberto, right?
Roberto Lovato. I believe you played Keystone Quarter in the 70s?
Yeah, Tom Barkin.
I was there.
Oh, yeah.
All right. We've been trying to get you to come to PDX Jazz for several years. What made you decide to come this year?
Well, I suppose I got another agent. It might have had something to do with it. Yeah.
Anyway.
Usually the answers on business stuff is on that level.
Oh, thank you for
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. So I'm going to end with one last thing here. There's this incredible documentary coming out on Miles Davis next Tuesday on PBS called Birth of the Cool. And Archie, you're in it, sharing one story about, there was this moment about Archie's generosity in sharing the stage with other performers. And this is another moment where you were asked to generously, or you requested of Miles to be generous to allow you to perform. But in the documentary, there's only part 1 of the story, and I'm wondering if you can complete that for us and kind of put the cap on the discussion today.
Well, I knew Tony.
Tony Williams.
Tony Williams is drummer because we had replaced. We did a show called The Connection. That was when I was with Cecil Taylor. And we were replacing the Jackie McLean, Freddie Red ensemble.
And that was a theater piece, too.
It was a theater piece by Jack Gelder. And when they came back, they hired a new drummer, Tony Williams. And later on, Tony was hired by Miles Davis. So this night I came down to the Village Vanguard where Miles was performing because by that time Tony had left Jackie McLean's ensemble and he was with Miles Davis. In fact, he'd acquired quite a reputation by that time as one of the important drummers on the scene. And when I came in to the club, I usually carried my horn with me at that time. And I was hoping by chance that maybe I could sit in with the Miles, although probably I wasn't ready musically to do what I would probably have done. But as soon as I got in the door, Tony... He recognized me from the time we had done the show at the Living Theater. And he said, "Archie, check your horn out, man. Come on and play some with us." So I said, "Well, Tony, I don't know. Miles may not be open to the idea." And he said, "Oh, no, don't worry. You hear stories, but he's a nice guy. You're gonna
a sweetheart."
Yeah. So I allowed myself to be talked into this, and I suppose it's partly because I was hoping that he would allow me to sit in. And so I approached him very, very delicately because he was surrounded by a coterie of admirers and people. He was deep in conversation with some people, and I took the liberty I dared to interrupt his conversation, and I said, Mr. Davis, my name is Archie Shepp, and immediately he said, Archie who? And so I said, Archie Shepp. So he said, fuck you. And he went on, and Miles, as Jackie McLean's mentioned in a book called Four Lines in the Bebop Business, he says, Miles could really cuss. And he must have called me everything but a child of God, if not. And so at a certain point, I had 2 children, then I was married. I was a young man, but I had respected him, but I felt that he was totally disrespecting me. So at a certain point, I responded to him in kind. And so I said, fuck you, who the fuck are you? And we got into this terrible argument, which went on for quite some time. We went into his dressing room. The Vanguard didn't really have a dressing room. They had a little place in the kitchen. But we were both busily engaged in a repartee. So one of his sons was there, was a boxer. And Miles was a boxing enthusiast. So he says to me, my son will kick your ass. So I said to him, I'll kick your ass on the bandstand. That's where the music is made. And so, but at that point, he took on another attitude altogether. It was rather like the old West, you know. He said, "Take your horn out, motherfucker." Take your horn out, motherfucker. He says to me, and so that's how I got to sit in with Miles Davis. So the first tune he played was 4. And when I took my solo, I was both intimidated and angry. So I played intimidation and anger. It had nothing to do with the song. And, so he shook his horn after the film. And the next one was Around Midnight, in which I did more or less the same thing. I played totally away from. And the third was Oleo. Ba-ba-dee, ba-ba-dee, da-da, ba-ba-doo-dee, da-da-doo-da. And although I had heard, I even learned John's solo on that rendition. No, I hadn't, because it was before. Well, I had, because it was Wayne Shorter on tenor, and Herbie, and Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. And about the middle of the song, he shook his horn one more time, and he walked off the bandstand. And shortly after my solo. And a little later, Herbie got up from the piano and he walked off. And then Wayne followed Herbie. So that just left me with Ron Carter and Tony. And I didn't use the piano much anyway, so I didn't really miss it when the piano left. And we went on for about another half hour. just the bass, drums, and tenor. And then all of a sudden I heard a piano. And it was Herbie, he had come back. And then after that I heard a tenor saxophone play. And it was Wayne, he had come back. And the story goes that Miles didn't come back for the rest of the week. And after that, he began to play some of the originals of Herbie and Wayne, who were both fine composers, but he never played their music until that point. And because prior to that, I'd heard him several times with Cannonball and Train and Red Garland and like that. And he played the same repertoire, Around Midnight, War, All of You. Those were the things that he played at the time. And it wasn't until he got that night, as I understand, that he began to listen and to use original works written by his own sidemen. Up to that time, he had played mostly standards and ballads.
That's incredible. That's a triumphant occasion there, and you know, I think you won the showdown.
Well, I don't know if I won it, but I was in it.
Definitely. And in the documentary, no spoilers here, but you'll see that whole story is kind of truncated, and it ends with "fuck you."
I think, I think that's partly because he knew, and I still say that Miles was an idol to me, a man who, despite how he felt about me, I always felt that he was one of the great people, musically speaking, in the African American tradition. And I told him that it embarrassed me to have to engage him on that level, because I look at him more as an artist, a genius. And there are other ways to tell people that they can't perform other than to say, fuck you.
Of course.
So, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Archie Shepp. Don't forget, 7 o'clock tonight in Newmark Theater.
Thank you.
Real quick, everybody, please do.